wrinkle that you see, so I don't.
So what I'm going to do a quick little marker for the
No problem.
tape, and then what I like to do, I usually go fairly chronologically. I always start with people's family histories. I think that's where they came from, and obviously, and what informed them. So we'll start there, and
feisty grandmother and a
exactly.
grandfather who didn't play.
So, and I'll also just tell you right now that because they were recording digitally, we stop every once in a while to just save the files.
No problem.
So we'll take little breaks.
Yeah.
And anytime that you want to take a break, just let us know.
Yeah, I've done.
Okay. And anywhere you want to take the interview, you take it. So
you ever get to Baton Rouge, the new museum, state museum that's there? You hear me.
Okay.
And we did a lot of digital recording then.
Yeah.
So I've been on both sides of it. I've done a bunch of radio and stuff like that too. So
I like being on this side. All right, great.
I prefer that side, but yeah.
So today it is the 10th of May, and we are at the African American Museum in Fair Park in Dallas, Texas. This is David Klein talking. David Klein from UNC's Southern Oral History Project and Virginia Tech. And I'm here with Charles Chuck Siler, also with John Bishop, who is behind the camera, John Bishop of Media Generation and UCLA. And we're all here today as part of the Civil Rights History Project on behalf of the Library of Congress and the Smithsonian's Museum of African American History and Culture. And Chuck, I just wanted to say thank you so much for being part of this project.
You're welcome. I'm happy to be here.
And if we could start, if you could just tell us a little bit about the family into which you were born, and how you may have seen that environment shaping the kind of work and things that you went on to do.
Well, I think what is, I had a big family, for one. My mother and father were divorced early, though my father and I did get to be good friends later in life. My mother was a beautician, and so naturally she was in a position to hear everybody's business, and I think she was well trusted because she didn't tell what she heard. My grandmother was a piano player. Her career was spent playing for churches, teaching music, choirs, this and that, and I was her first grandchild, so I could have been a little bit spoiled. My grandfather, I was the first grandchild that he had a chance to spend any time with, and he was alive till I was 7. So he was an influence in terms of the fact that he abetted my creativity, I guess. My grandmother found me when I was, as she said, about 15, 16 months old. I found a pencil, and we had these lower half of the walls in the house that they had bought were wooden, and she saw me trying to draw on the wall. And her story was that I wasn't just scratching on the wall, but I was trying to draw little stick figures and things. So she told me if I wanted to do that, ask for paper and pencil. And so 2 of the first words that I learned, according to her, were paper and pencil, because she said I started asking her for that almost every day. But the upside for her was she could put me in a corner with a pad, a Big Chief Indian pad, which I remember, and a pencil, and leave me there all day. So the upside was she used to always start out reading every day with the cartoons. Her attitude was she'd get a laugh in first, then get to the serious news. And I come from a family of folk who had, I think, great senses of humor. My father, in fact, also. When I got to know him as an adult, I discovered that his sense of humor was very well intact, too. And my mother is 92, and she still can be funny when she wants to. But my mother had 6 brothers, all of whom had a lot of influence on me. And one of my father's, his oldest brother, Eugene, was another influence. He lived about 40, 50 miles away in Lafayette, Louisiana, but we were in contact. And my family in Baton Rouge was one that encouraged me. I had all of them were readers, so I grew up reading. I started reading when I was, and my younger brother, when we were both about 2. You know, we were able to read a sentence and do things. When I started school, I was 5, and they let me, you know, my first grade teacher was a neighbor, and she took me because I was the only black kid in the neighborhood at the time. And so I went to school with her, and I did well enough that she asked the principal, who also lived in the neighborhood, but things were different then because my parents, my mother, had gone to school or had been taught by half of the same folk who taught me years later. So everyone knew everyone else. You know, I had relatives who,
Segregated schools.
yeah, I had folk who, one of my aunts was secretary at my high school, another one taught home economics, who was married to my mother's brother. And so, you know, there were those people there. My Uncle Ralph was head custodian at my high school and became later parish-wide supervisor of custodial things in Baton Rouge. So the family was very well known in terms of that. He was also a caterer, great cook, you know. And I learned a lot from that. My wife tells me she married me because I could read and cook, and I have to blame my family for that. But at times, too, when I did things that were sort of, as they like to say now, out the box, I was supported by that. You guys made me start thinking about this because I was trying to go back to when I first protested something. And my first protest, as much as I laugh about it now, was against the Boy Scouts. Because in the 50s, when I was probably 11, 12 years old, we marched in the Boy Scout parade, and we were proud of the fact that we had little drill teams and we could learn moves and this and that. But in Baton Rouge, they put the black Boy Scouts behind the horses. And I think I did the first 2 years, and I had to clean my shoes after that. And I decided I wasn't going to do that. Well, I had a scoutmaster who wasn't in line with that with me, so I quit the Boy Scouts and started an Explorer post at my school. But it was the first active protest that I did and got away with. I went to McKinley High in Baton Rouge. McKinley was well known for being great at academics, great at athletics, and we would fight anybody and usually win. And South Baton Rouge was, you know, inner city, urban. It wasn't as bad as some of the inner cities now. We didn't shoot as many, you know, folk weren't getting shot, this or that, but you would fight and you had to learn to do that kind of thing. When the Southern University demonstration in March of 1960 happened, they had to lock us on campus because we were ready to go out and do it.
So tell me a little bit more about that. When you say you were ready to go out, in what way? And
we were ready to go and join the demonstration. You know, we heard about it. Somebody said students from Southern are marching downtown, and most of us were ready to say, "Let's go, let's go and join them." You know,
Did you feel like you had a sense of what was going on politically in the world?
we
or in
knew
the community?
because we had, you know, I've told kids this, and I hate to say it, okay, but I think the kids that I used to talk to about the civil rights movement when I worked at the State Museum. You may have that in Louisiana, but there were a few schools that I went to where they were interested in things like the civil rights movement, and there were social studies teachers who had the signs up, the white and black, you know, white and colored at that sign. And I told them about things that we used to do to protest. You know, we would take a paper cup, go into the men's room, use it, and pour it over the white water fountains. It was our way of protesting what we could, you know, because we couldn't, you know, and we were treated bad. You know, folk would throw money at you. My Uncle Gene started the first black cleaners in Lafayette, Louisiana. He had to, when in the early days, sit in his shop at night with his gun because they threw bricks, they shot, things up. But he had a reputation for shooting back. And he was a person that until he died, I loved the man. Like he was, he felt that since my father and mother had divorced and they gone, he felt obligated to be close to me, keep me linked to the Siler side of the family. Well, the Silers had left Alabama, my uncles and my father, and that much because they had a reputation for shooting back. And Mobile, in that area where they were from, in the 30s and 40s, that wasn't a part of it. My father also played baseball, which let him see a lot of it. He had some good friends. Satchel Paige was one of them that I happened to meet once, and I thought it was one of the great moments of my life in 1967. But my father stayed involved with baseball most of his life. He started the Compton County Mac Baseball League, and he told me the stories about the fights that they had in California. But that league sent over 600 players to the pros. And when I worked at Southern for a few years later, I started with one of the coaches at Southern, Lee Flintroy, had played ball with my father for the Black Pelicans in New Orleans. And when he found out that he played third base, second base, and my father was a shortstop, and he said, "You're Chuck Siler's son, da-da-da-da." And I put them in touch, and a lot of guys out of Compton went through Southern and to the other HBCUs. So, little things like that, that family network of sorts. Most of my uncles, with possibly one exception, worked for themselves. My uncle Peter, who was one of those that I was named after, his name was Ernest, hence the E in my name. My uncle TJ was a insurance salesman. Most of them had been in World War II. All of them, my Uncle Earl was a tailor. They had learned these things. My two youngest uncles had been in Korea. Well, one was in Korea, one was in service as a medic during the Korean War, but he couldn't get a job when he got out. So he worked as a waiter, and like I said, he was the one who later became supervisor of in the Baton Rouge Schools District of custodial services and things. And he had his own business until long after he retired. The thing was they tended to be independent. My grandfather spoiled me. Like I said, I was the first grandchild that he had in two families to have time with. And so, we would listen to all the old radio shows when he had to babysit me because my grandmother had choir rehearsals and things during the week. This was her living. And she made, for that time, a fairly good living playing music. First thing, and John would appreciate this, that she told me was a story about what got her in the gospel. One part was she was raised by her uncle and aunt, her uncle was a Methodist minister named Mansfield Jones. But she got punished because she was playing the blues. She liked to play the blues. She played a stride type piano. There's a piano player out there now who I've heard play with her, and I wish I'd recorded it, named Henry Butler, who has a style very similar, big left hand, big comping left hand. And she played the Yellow Dog Blues for me. I have loved the blues ever since. Okay, for all she did with gospel, the blues got me, okay? And a lot of my friends that I grew up with in Baton Rouge are blues players and things like that. And so we, are still, I'm still tied to that. The act of civil disobedience, my senior year of high school, after the Southern demonstration, a group of us, I'm trying to remember names, Moses Edwards, Betty Jones, Enola Price, Theodis Washington, who's not with us any longer, we were a part of some of us were NAACP Youth Council folk.
I'm sorry, Betty
Jones.
and Moses.
Betty Jean Jones, yeah.
Who's the first one, Moses?
Edwards.
Edwards, okay.
Yeah, and I think Moses is still alive. We graduated, class of 60, but after we took our final examinations, about 2 weeks before we were supposed to march, we decided that we were going to pull our protests. And so my family looked up one night, and there I was with a picket sign in front of the state library because we had tried to use it, and they didn't let us in. So
There was a
we
was there a black so-called black branch somewhere?
there were we had the Carver Branch Library, and I spent a lot of time there because they finally moved, at one point moved it around the corner from my house, and so I would, they had to read 12 books and you get the certificate things, and I'd read 40 books in the summertime so I could have 3 or 4 certificates. But Miss Bennett, who was the librarian, had a son, Herbert Bennett, who was one of my first teachers, who was a very talented artist. And as I said, at that time, I had an uncle, Willie Jr., we called him Son, who was also a very talented artist. But at that time, there was very little outlet there. And my uncle's son had to leave Baton Rouge because he had gotten into a fight with some guys. And the best description I can give you of him is he looked like Burt Lancaster in brown face. He was about 6 feet tall, and he had a Charles Atlas build, but he had been driving trucks and loading trucks since he was 10, 11 years old for the Bologna brothers in Baton Rouge. And so he had this build that was there. He died after being shot by another American soldier. Or he didn't die immediately. He lived 9 more years, but he was shot with a machine gun. And he had probably almost 60 surgeries over the years, removing shrapnel as it came to the surface, But during that time, he was very much an influence on me also because he was encouraging when it came to my art. And he showed me that he could draw. And, I had never seen anybody do it that well, nobody black. I'd seen all of these other things. And later when I had a chance to study with some, I think, great artists, I was able to appreciate it because of some of what had come there. But my uncles and my grandmother, particularly when we hit the state library, I'm going back to that, didn't put me out of the house. They...
Can I stop you just for a second?
Yeah.
To ask 2 questions. So one is, you mentioned sort of you were on the cusp of graduation, so there was a timing issue going on. So if you could say a little bit about that, and then also specifically what it was why you targeted the library.
We couldn't use it. And I was, like I said, at Carver Branch, I tried to, I don't know if I read every book in the library, but I read most of what I could find out, okay? I went through one phase where I lived, the part of Baton Rouge where I grew up at one point in this history had been called Moccasin Hole. We had snakes all over the place, every kind of snake. My backyard was a veritable. To overcome fear, I went and read everything I could on snakes. At one point, I wanted to be a herpetologist. I drew snakes, sketched snakes, and I had teachers again, like Ben Hall, who was my biology teacher. Mr. Hall let me bring a pet snake in for a demonstration. It was a hognose snake. Lepidoptera contrix was the... His name was Irving. He became a cartoon later, too. But Irving was the first opportunity that I had to do this. I had teachers who always taught us. The saying when I was in school was that you had to be twice as good if you were black to get half as much. My teacher said, okay, you got to be 3, 4, 5 times as good. And we grew up with that. We had silent support from a lot of them, even though they couldn't speak up when we went out and protested. Now, the reason we did it for the most part, after we had been planning it, but the reason we waited until after we finished our examinations was because of the fact that they couldn't use missing that against us. Okay, and we had about 2 weeks. We finished examinations, and about this time in May, our graduation was the 26th, which I'll never forget because it was my aunt's birthday, and later my wedding day, we were married on the 26th of May. But during that time, we started our protest. We started picketing, we started doing things, and they had to watch us. And there were other kids at Southern High, a few from Capitol, who were Capitol Avenue, another one of the schools, who were getting involved in the activity because Greenville had happened, then Southern happened. People don't know this, but Southern's first demonstration was the largest of the mass demonstrations to hit the South in 1960. Marvin Robinson, who lives here in Dallas now, he's recovering from a stroke, I was told. Donald Moss, who I think is back in Louisiana, I'm not certain, but I've got a friend in Baton Rouge, Mayo Brew, who was from Winfield. In Winfield, they tried to integrate the library there, and he had a gun put to his head by the sheriff. And, when he tells that story about it, I've never seen him talk about it without becoming emotional. But it's if you've ever been shot at, or if you've ever had someone threaten you that way, you don't forget that. And it was something that, it made it difficult for me to be nonviolent later. I met Martin Luther King in 1962. I had a chance to shake his hand, and he, at the NAA convention in Atlanta, came around the room and shook everybody, all the young folk. He shook our hands, and gave us a word or two of encouragement. But I'll have to backtrack to get to that point. But they wanted to put us out of school in '60, but they couldn't. One reason being, all of the guys that I named that were a part of this that I can remember now were the best students in the class. Our valedictorian and salutatorian didn't participate, but then again, different reasons. Most of us were the ones who had gone through it, who lived who lived out there with it, who put up with it, and we weren't as sheltered, and we were very forward, and we were going to be out there saying what we had to say. So we did what we could. We started that. Things settled down a bit, and all of us went wherever to school. I went to Southern.
Can I stop you just for a second?
Yeah.
And ask you about this You talked a little bit about this already, but the support behind you I'm interested in. So clearly you've got, some of you have your families. You talked about, your family's so interested because of this history of independent business owners and this kind of independence that your family particularly had, but that you often see in, petitions.
One of the things that was funny, my Uncle Ralph, when my grandmother died, and I were talking after the funeral, and he told me, he says, your grandfather used to ride. My grandfather rode a bicycle to work. He had worked on the railroad, and as he got too old to work trains, he became the janitor at the Roundhouse in Baton Rouge. I remember going with him when I was about 3-4 years old. He took me down to Cedar, and these giant trains, when you're that tall and the train is 20 feet, it looks huge, and everybody knew Willie, and he always rode a bicycle to work. And my Uncle Ralph told me, he says, Daddy rode a bike, and that's what we all called him, Daddy. He says, to work because he wasn't going to pay a dime and have somebody to tell him where to sit on the bus. Okay, he generally wore coveralls to work, but every Sunday morning, he was head deacon at his church. He was in a suit, and he would walk to church. I'd gone with him a few times here or there. But he was, he was a model for manhood. And I was his oldest grandchild. And at that time, he was going to you know, give. Didn't know that then, but whatever was there was a part of what later made me understand that I could speak up. And I had learned from my mother and from my grandmother that right or wrong, if I felt I was right, I was going to say it. Now, sometimes I got spanked for it, but my mother learned early on that I was hard-headed enough that if I knew I was right, and she learned that, she could spank me. And I told her the last time I got a spanking, I said, well, you can do this, but I'm not going to cry. And so I took the spanking and I looked back at her, and my question was, are you finished? And I never got another one. But I had to sacrifice that because then I had my mother and my grandmother in each ear in stereo talking to me about what I had done wrong when I did. So I was kept on track. In school, I had some teachers. Mr. Hall was one in particular. I ran into his grandson a few weeks ago here that I hadn't known, Mr. Altimus, who had been in World War II also with my uncles and things, who had what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder. I didn't understand, guys would laugh because they said they could set off a firecracker and Mr. Altimus would dive under the desk almost. Well, when I got back from Vietnam, I apologized to Mr. Altimus for having been one of those guys who would laugh when somebody did something like that and they say, oh, Mr. Altimus would do. Well, I understood why he dove under the desk. I'd been through rocket attacks and things like that. Okay, so those loud noises, I still got tinnitus from being too close to a howitzer, without protection. And those kind of things, you learn to appreciate later in life. But these were the guys who also were supporting us quietly. They didn't want to lose their jobs. We didn't want them to lose their jobs. But they didn't say, I never heard you wrong. Mr. Hall has some daughters who are still alive who are like little sisters of mine, because Mr. Hall would sit there and tell you what they had, and we heard the stories of what people had gone through, and they were reinforced in the neighborhood, all of that. Freya Anderson, whose father was a member of the was on the board of the NAA in Baton Rouge, we were on a panel together at LSU in February of this year, and Dr. Anderson, who was a dentist, was one of the leaders of the civil rights movement in Baton Rouge. In 1961, I started off, I was a foot soldier. I wasn't one of the leaders. I got involved because they needed somebody to make signs. I was an art major. And Diana Manning, who died a few years ago, and I were two of the first art majors to make signs.
This is at Southern?
Yeah, protest signs. We were at Southern. Yeah. I was a sophomore. The funny thing is, I was a member of the Persian Rifles drill team, and I was at the time a pledgee, and I later became a PR. But the fire team leader next to me was Hubert Gerard Brown, who later became known as H. Rap Brown. I've known him since junior high school. We got to be close in college because we used to hitchhike to school together. We lived in the same part of town, and so, for protection in part too, because it wasn't easy to be out there, and it was always easier to hitchhike with somebody and we would do that from Southern because we didn't have bus service to the school. And if you were up there late at night, we had to get home, so it was either walk, and there was a part of Baton Rouge called Dixie that we didn't really want to walk through at night because anything could happen on Scenic Highway. And so we try to catch people coming off campus, going home, and everybody got to know us over a period of time. Well, in 1961, we started doing this, and then they started teaching us nonviolent protests, how to go into the famous curl and the whole thing if you were getting beaten.
And you went to actual training sessions?
We had sessions there was the the College Inn off campus. The guy let us use his place, and after they closed, it moved the tables aside. And we had Dave Dennis from CORE, Jerome Smith, who is still in New Orleans. He runs an organization called Tambourine and Fan. Yeah, we were all for Jerome Smith. Yeah, Jerome was a freedom rider. He has stories that, like I said, he was a leader. Ronnie Moore is still in New Orleans. Ronnie's daughter Desi is married to Wes Anderson, the saxophonist that played. And Ronnie, I think, is still running a program or working at Tulane, if I'm correct. But
We're actually going to talk to Darmy Bailey.
the Army? Yeah, I know the Army. Yeah.
Can I interrupt for a second?
Yeah.
There's two things that you, one is, could you tell us what happened with the man who got machine gunned by a white man? Was there a story about that?
My uncle?
Yeah, you're
My uncle just happened to be a person that would fight back. The reason he had to leave Baton Rouge was because two guys jumped him. It was during a time when they could get away with things like beating up on black folk. I knew of cases where cops would have billy club practice, as some folk we used to call it, on people. Okay, my uncle, as I said, was one of. He was strong enough to take, like, the front of a Volkswagen. He could literally lift it on a system. You know, he was that strong. He hit a guy and supposedly broke his neck, from what I was told, and he had to leave. When he got drafted, he was working in a war plant, a munitions plant or something up north in Kansas or somewhere like that, as close as I can get to it. And he had changed his name. He added an R instead of Willie Moulton Jr. The family name was Moulton in Louisiana. He had added an R. He was Willie Morton Jr. That was enough in those days to get him past that. But he went into the military. I don't know what prompted it, but he was a person who would fight back. Okay, and generally he was a person whom, if you had a fight with, he was going to, I didn't want him to ever hit me. He made me go back and fight a guy who was bigger than me once. And I stayed in the fight more out of fear of him than getting hurt. And I took a good butt whipping for about half an hour before the other guy gave up. Because every time I wanted to stop, I'd look and he'd be standing there just watching me. And after it was all over, he told me, he says, I didn't say you had to win the fight. He said, I said you had to fight. And his thing was, he says, bullies don't want people to fight back. Oh, he says, I never had another fight with that guy again, because he understood that I was my uncle died not long after that, but one of those pieces of shrapnel nicked something, and, that killed him. And he was like 39 years old at the time. But the thing was, it was one of the lessons I learned. My Uncle Gene, who my wife knew and my son also got to know, after his experience in Lafayette, we moved out of the heart of town into a little area called Scott that at the time was fairly well unincorporated, but he had about 2 acres of land, maybe 3, and he was never further away than maybe 20 feet from one of his hidden guns, because he was always wary of that. My father was also, all of them, they weren't NRA, but the terrorists they were worried about were a totally different brand, okay? One of the brothers, Earl, became a minister in Paris, California. And his son, Don, is a bishop now. I don't know how they do these things. I'm not a good churchgoer, okay? But the family has a history like that. My Uncle Gene, used to kid. He told me, he says, I didn't shoot the sheriff. He says, but I almost shot the deputy. And they were looking for him at one point, and the guy who was the deputy that saw where he was hiding was a friend of his and knew he wasn't guilty of anything and told the guys he wasn't there. This is the story he told me later. He said, and so he was able to get away and get away from Mobile. He had to leave. And so, I had that growing up. I had these guys, these voices in my, and all of them were standing up. My Uncle Ralph, the funniest story that I've ever heard of him was a guy walked up to him when he was on his knees saying his prayers in the barracks when he was in the Army and started playing the dozens with him. Well, my Uncle Ralph got up, beat the guy. I mean, beat him really good, then turned around, got back on his knees and finished saying his prayers. And I always had these guys saying, so when it came down to that, when I was 19 years old and that activity started, I was going to be a part of it. And I went from painting protest signs to going through the training, and then I went on a sit-in for the first time, and that was, different because I joke about it now. I can't help it. I think it's a part of what made me decide that maybe at 80 I'm going to become a full-time stand-up comic or something. But every guy the terrorists that we had to deal with, I don't know where they got these guys from, but these guys were all 6'8", 6'9". They looked like pro football players. They didn't have their hoods on, but, we knew who they were. And they were there to intimidate. Well, at the time, I might have weighed 175, 180 pounds. I was the same height that I am now, but that's a lot of difference when it comes to looking at 300-pounders, and their arms are as big as my waistline was at the time. So I became more of an observer to a point after that because my attitude was going to be that if something happened, I was going to have to fight. If no more than just to get away. But I was not good at seeing women get hit or thinking I could take that without, some kind of response to it. We went to jail. 12th of December, if I recall the date correctly, a group of us were arrested and taken downtown for picketing. We were picketing the Bon Marché Center, I think, out on Florida Street. And we were taken into the Baton Rouge jail, and we were given the usual, if you come back down here, we're putting you in jail, we're going to keep you tomorrow, And Willie Bradford, who's in Shreveport now, Willie Bradford, Thomas Pete, Theta Ambrose, I think, was with us. I'm trying to remember Janelle's last name, and it just slipped my mind. But Bradford turned to the cop and said, "What are you going to do with the other 5,000?" And this guy turned red. I thought he was ready to hit him, but Bradford, and the thing I think that made it even worse was Brad was black, but Brad was, if you didn't know he was black, you couldn't, but he was, he knew. And he wasn't hiding it. And he and Thomas Pete, who were very light-skinned guys, I think sometimes enraged the racists more so than the darker folk did. They knew why but these guys didn't necessarily, they could have slipped across the line and passed, not at Southern. Southern always looked like an integrated school because of the broad range of color that you had there. And so the next day we went back out, we protested again, and we wound up going to jail. I spent the Christmas holidays of 1961 in the East Baton Rouge Parish Jail. Now, the day after that, not just Southern University students, but Baton Rouge citizens joined the march, and they had, from what I was told from the guys who were down there, at least 5,000 people were down there. The press underplayed it. But we were up on the line on top of the jailhouse, and it was split. There was a neutral area, and there were cells on one side, cells on the street side. And we walked over to the street side, and we were standing up looking out at the windows, and we could see the crowd assembled. And there were people going in both directions as far as we could see through the oak trees that were down there.
And they were protesting
They were
this is
protesting our
your
arrest.
arrest.
Yeah. We had been arrested once. There was a rally the night when we got back. We went back out the next day because they dared us to come back, and we took the dare. Okay. If I recall correctly, I didn't stay at home that night because I was afraid somebody might try to talk me out of it. But we went back downtown. One of the things I was kind of good at was whenever we had protests, I had this thing with voices. And when I knew sometime, I didn't tell the guys I was doing this all at the time, but I would get on the phone and call down to the police and call in a report that they had some Negroes out there and that they were over here, they're all over the place. And they would go this way and we'd be over here. And, I had that streak. I still have it. I couldn't be different. But we went back down. They came, and they put 340 of us plus in a space that was built for about 42 people. When the demonstration came downtown, we were looking out, and we saw, everybody's dressed neatly. Nobody's about to start anything. And they started singing, "We Shall Overcome." And we started singing back. Okay, it was the 13 of us then. An hour later, they were bringing them in, from this. But
Because 13 from the first day.
yeah, we were in jail on one side, and the girls were, there was a wall separating us in the girls' line, or the female line, as the women's line, and we started singing back
From within the jail.
from atop the jail, yeah, and they could hear us, and you got kind of a cheer or something that went up, and they started singing, and then all of a sudden we heard pop, pop, popping dogs, and the police actually rioted. It wasn't the protesters; they were peaceful, but just the song "We Shall Overcome" set them off. And they used enough tear gas that we were on like what would have been the fifth floor of the building, I guess. We could smell the tear gas in the line. They moved us and locked down that half of the jail so that we couldn't get into the cells on that side. They later opened it back up because we didn't have anywhere to go. It was almost standing room only. Okay, we all came out of there a lot older than we went in. We were in there for 3 weeks. When we came out, it was January 2nd, I guess. And our lawyers, Eli, Collins, and Douglas, Lolis, Eli, Bob Collins, and Niels Douglas, came to get us out. Lolis, Eli, and I are still friends. His son is a journalist who is now living in L.A. He worked on the Treme television series as a story editor, but Lolis used to write for the Picayune in New Orleans. His father was a little guy who was about 5'4", 5'5", and when they brought us downstairs to, release us, he came through a crowd of giant deputies, and it was like Moses parting the water. And Lolis was fearless, I guess you'd say. I mean, that's the only thing I can think of to describe him. He's another person whom, if I had to recommend people to talk to, is in New Orleans, that I said, you got to talk to Lolis Eli, okay, because his stories had to be great. But we continued the protest when we got out of jail. Felton Clark, who was president of the University of Southern,
Now, did you get bailed out, or how did you get?
we were bailed out, yes.
With charges? What were the
Which illegal picketing, things like that. The charges were thrown out before we ever got to trial. But they really, they knew it was. Most of the reason we were in jail was to quash the protest. Jail was used as a punitive form of punishment. It wasn't about whether we were right or wrong. It was that we shouldn't. We were out of. We were uppity. Okay, and I've been called that since then, so it's not gone. And I mean recently.
For a second. So, we're back. You're on.
Oh, great.
Okay, so I guess pick up where we left off.
Okay, when we were all finally, banned from campus, again, somehow some of the people who were friendly, and since I lived in Baton Rouge, I was able to ease onto and off of campus to visit, see my girlfriend at the time, things like that. But I started work, and
But
we,
you were expelled
Tell me about some experiences you had growing up.
as a student?
yeah, there were a variety of different reasons used, grades, this and that. I was bored. I think my grades were probably borderline because of the fact that I missed so many classes and things like that. Though I passed, I'm trying to remember if I flunked anything. I may have flunked one course or something because of that, but we were all put out of school basically, and a lot of people didn't return to school as a result of that. I was, like I said, 19 years old. 62. I made 19 in 62. In fact, I was 18 still. But Reverend Jelkson, Reverend Robert Walker, who were with the NAACP in Baton Rouge, offered me a job working for the NAACP running a voter registration project. And I walked over, I guess, 2/3 of the southern part of Baton Rouge, door to door, trying to teach people how to pass what was supposed to be, and I say in quotes, a voter registration test. Basically, it was a form that they had to fill out. And any and every excuse that could be used, short of giving your birth date down to the second, was used to keep people out. We found some old voter registration forms and tests and things that they used to give that Rhonda had, and she has students nowadays who look at them and can't believe what they had to go through then. I worked out of an office on South 13th Street, and I always think back about that because it was an area where when I was a kid, I had worked as a shoe shine boy and cleanup guy at a barber shop on 13th and Government Street in Baton Rouge. I was born about 3 blocks away on South 13th. It's now Eddie Robinson Drive after the coach from Grambling. And, it's funny because Eddie and my mother and were all classmates. And they all went to Leland College and stuff like that before. But I worked that area. Fortunately, in that area, most of the black people knew me. Though I had some who were determined not to get involved. One guy chased me out of his yard with a hoe. Another one had a dog that wouldn't let me out of the yard once I got in. He wanted to play, but whenever I started toward the gate, he growled. So when the man got home, he let me out. But I was active with the NAACP then.
Why was that, do you think, that some were so reluctant to get involved, as you say?
Fear. They didn't want to lose their jobs. I had a few relatives. Usually it wasn't the immediate relatives. Those who may not have liked what I did didn't say anything because they would have had to put up with my grandmother. And my grandmother backed me. I have to give her credit for that. She, she knew that sometime it had to happen, and that, I had been raised to stand up. And so, it was consistent with my upbringing, I guess, if I had to say anything like that. And it, it was me, I guess, I was also still, trying to write and do things like that. And so through the spring and the summer of 1962, I worked out of that office during the protests. The NAA secretary, a lady named Pearl George, who was just a few years older than I was at the time, worked in the office with me when, she wasn't going to school herself and doing whatever. She became a city council person years later. But Reverend Jelks, Arthur Jelks, and Reverend Walker were the two, and Dr. Anderson were the NAA folk who were closest to me at the time. I guess I can say this now. I went to the NAACP convention in Atlanta in 1962 representing Baton Rouge, and I walked in and almost started a fight with the Klansmen outside the Atlanta Convention Center. They were picketing I stopped in the middle of their picket line to make them walk. You're 19 years old. I had just turned 19 at the time, and so I was, I was almost 200 pounds and big enough to think that I could be. And the guys had to say, "Come on, ease off of this." But a guy named Al Jones and I, during the middle of that convention, pulled a sit-in at a little place called the Crystal in Atlanta. And we had some Jewish kids who were there, went in, bought food, and had it sitting in front of us. We walked in, they got up and let us sit down, and we proceeded to eating. Well, they didn't know what to do with us, so they locked the place, put hot water on the stove in pots, turned them up, and steamed up the place. Basically, I guess trying to, heat. Okay, I went to Vietnam because it wasn't cold. Okay, so heat wasn't gonna run us out. And Al, I hope he's still alive, was from St. Louis. Yeah, it's like I'm from Louisiana. Summer or not, you don't steam me out of a place and think that's going to do it. I've been in much worse than that. And we got into sort of hot water with some of the NAACP leadership because we didn't know at the time that we weren't supposed to have done that because they had sort of had a no protest agreement going on. And nobody told us about that because I was there alone. Ralph Casimir, Dr. Raphael Casimir, who was with the New Orleans chapter, was there then. We didn't know each other, but I ran for a national office during that time for the Youth Commission, and they finally got rid of me on the fourth vote. Okay, but Clara Looper, Daisy Bates, oh boy, what's my girl's name? I'm trying to, Ella Baker. Those ladies took us aside and told us we were okay. They had their problems with some of the leadership at the time too. And, I guess it was, in one sense, second-class citizenship for women that was still being overcome in terms of the old hierarchy. And an elitist group, organizations did this, which was one of the things that put me outside of a lot of it, and I think made me go to where I am now. But Reverend Jelks was one of the people that I admired because he was a country preacher. Reverend Walker, on the other hand, was a well-educated preacher. They were both AME ministers, but they were committed And they kept us on track. You know, because of them, I met Medgar Evers. I was at a meeting with he and his brother Charles, who I love. Charles was one of my heroes because Charlie Evers said, said once, he says, if you ever hit me, all you lose is the swing. He said, you're going to get the blowback. And, philosophically, I was with him on that. But we had a meeting at the church on South Boulevard in Baton Rouge, and I didn't realize, the impact of that, because 3 days later, Medgar Evers got shot. And I was very upset. But I was already back in school. I was writing for the school newspaper, cartooning for it and stuff like that, and staying sort of in front of the dean of students' desk almost every week for something that I had done. And he later told me he missed me because he enjoyed ILO coverage. He was always wondering what I was going to do next or what we were going to do next as a staff, because we had a group of, at that time, energized students. We had a reason that 1963, 64, 65, we had reason to want to. Our president.
Ended up going back to school.
Yeah, I ended up going back to school, back to Southern. In fact, I went back that fall. They tried to get me for a violation of a federal injunction in the fall of 1962 because I took some kids to Fuquay Elementary School, and I embarrassed the principal who stood and gave a rant about us communist outside agitators coming in and doing this and that, and I explained to him in front of the TV camera that I had grown up down the street from that school. So I wasn't exactly an outside agitator, I was an inside agitator, and I wasn't going to stop agitating. Well, they wanted to put me in jail for a violation of a federal injunction, 10 years, $10,000 fines, ta-da. Reverend Jelks called the NAA office, and I think it was Gloucester Current, who was from Dallas, was the attorney that came down and talked to the district attorney in Baton Rouge, Sergeant Pitcher, whom, as funny as it might sound, had handled my mother's divorce, and whom, as a poor little kid, my grandmother had fed once or twice when he was growing up, and he remembered her. But my grandmother was very well known around Baton Rouge, because of her church work and her choirs and this and that, and the fact that she was. So all of those factors, I think, had something to do with my not going to jail, because it was trumped up anyhow. The first thing was the injunction was against CORE. I was a card-carrying NAACP member at the time, so NAA was not enjoined in that sense. Yeah, and the NAA also had the litigatory force. They had, they had Thurgood Marshall and people like that, and so they weren't going to win that fight. And as I said, when we went to jail earlier in '61, that the charges that they tried to to lay on us then were kicked out before we ever got to court, because they were basically unconstitutional. It was something that was punitive that they were trying to do to make us shut up. They didn't do that. Instead, some of us went in different directions. I used to send nasty cartoons to the Ku Klux Klan headquarters. Robert Shelton, didn't know who I was, never know who I was on the streets, but I picked on the Klan. I still pick on, I don't want to say just the conservatives, because I think anybody who's doing wrong, but as a registered independent, I have the right to do that, I think, and I still do.
When did you say it for a second?
Okay, we are rolling.
Okay, so We're back with Chuck Siler. You'll notice that we did move locations because turns out that the planet actually moves in the sun. So our light has shifted, so have we. Chuck, if we could pick up, unfortunately, due to time, we're going to move a little bit faster than we have been.
Okay.
But, we have been talking about your work with in protesting with the NAACP. I wonder if we should move on to leaving college and going west, and then your work in the Army.
Left college, I went west, moved to California, I got involved with theater, so with the American Theater, being with Frank Silvera. It managed to trade off a production design for some acting classes and a little bit of money and things like that, and started what was going to later become some time in Hollywood. I did work a little bit with Willis Thomas and the guys at the Hollywood NAA in the 70s, but I was drafted in 67, and I wound up going through one of those funny things, careers in the military that probably would make a good sitcom, because I had to go to Vietnam to get the job that I wanted, or that I enjoyed doing, and it was basically because I had been through, here we go, nuclear weapons school. Though I had a degree in art and a lot of experience writing for newspapers, and I did manage for 3 months to be editor of my college newspaper, just so I could legitimately say that I had done that, and I had to have some folk in that administration lobbying on my behalf to do that. The president didn't want that, but it happened. And my last summer at the school, I did edit the newspaper, and that next fall, I edited the alumni newsletter. So I graduated from Southern. I finished officially in January of '66 after going back to school. My stay in California the first time was fairly short, not quite 8 months, 9 months. I came back to the States after the military. Now, in the military, again, I was on charge of quarters the night that Martin Luther King was killed. And I was one of the older guys in the company. I was 24 at the time. I was a late draftee. I didn't know I was going to have to go. And there was turmoil. We had to talk folk out of, I was at Fort Huachuca, Arizona at the time, and we had to talk folk out of fights. I had to talk to some white officers who were afraid to let black soldiers go into things, and I had to tell them how not to go into some of the communities in Tucson, because the Hispanic and small black community that they had then, they were more afraid of what might happen there than what was going to happen in the other communities where they were more likely to have problems, and that was the white community. But they managed to get through that. It was not a good time, okay? When I got to Vietnam, I wound up, instead of being a truck driver, as they had wanted me to do after that strange odyssey from nuclear weapons to light vehicle driver school, and because I could type and I already had a degree in things like that, I was sent to an AG section as a senior clerk, and I wound up, because someone told them about that, editing the AG newspaper. After about 3 weeks of doing that.
What does AG stand for?
Adjutant General.
Okay.
Corps. The information office needed a replacement. Our company clerk, who was from California and considered me a homeboy, as they used to do, told the guys, said, we got a guy over here who's got, experience as a writer. He had seen a scrapbook that I had with some of my stuff in it. And Fred Call, who was NCOIC of the office, called me over asked if I might be interested in the job. Well, they knew I was an artist because I had started cartooning in the AG newspaper, which was a mimeograph sheet. Okay, I learned to draw. I learned etching from doing mimeograph and ditto and stuff like that. We're that old, okay? And so naturally I said yes. And I had a chance to travel, do stories and things like, and we were attached to the first logistical command, which was a command information office. I got to play with a little radio. We wrote stuff for television. We did a variety of things. And I hate to say I enjoyed that part of the military service. We had some problems because, again, we ran into racism. Okay, and it was deeply embedded in the older NCOs. Now, I met Grendel Howard, who later became first female sergeant major of the Army, who was a good friend of Fred Call, who was my NCOIC during that time. She came to visit. There was a major who later became a general, Sherian Kadoria, who went to Southern. She was a major at the time that I was there and was kind of surprised because she was a senior my freshman year at Southern, and here's another Southernite who showed up in the office. So I had friends. General Richards used the fact that I had a top secret clearance from nuclear weapons to be able to do some things, some sessions and things like that that other folk weren't cleared to do, but he could activate my clearance when he needed it and did. I got to see the country. I got to write about the black soldiers who were doing things. Hometown news releases, which were something that our guys weren't getting a lot of. But then again, I was the only black guy that I knew of at the time in the field doing stuff. There's a guy named Arnold Bourgeois, who was a cameraman in New Orleans for Channel 6. Arnold was on the Mopic team, and I happened to go out with them when they were getting ready to do a story, and we didn't realize for 30 years that we had met each other at the time until we started talking one day and did that. I came back, went to work for Southern. I was hired as sports information director and assistant public contacts director.
Can I interrupt and just ask one question, which is, you had this position in Vietnam where you were a voice for the black soldier, or helping to send some
what helped?
news back home.
Yeah, right. I took that up. I had a guy tell me that, asked me, I was called a racist because of the fact that I concentrated on that, but I had to point to a board that showed at one point that before I started doing it, we had probably 5% of the hometown news releases, for example, not the news stories. This guy's fixing, as a mechanic doing this kind of story. When we were out doing stories, those were little pickup things. Take a picture of a guy, write a brief little thing, send it down to Long Bend. It would go out to their hometown newspaper. Where they were, where they were from, those kind of things, what we put in, so they'd know where to send it. Okay? Some of the guys that I met, we were talking about that earlier, like Charlie Black from St. Louis. These were guys that I just happened to meet because I was older. Mm-hmm. And, they would come through and we'd run into each other or talk. Henri Huet from the AP and I went out to this orphanage, and we were talking, we were talking earlier about this. There were kids who had lost limbs. We saw one kid who had his jaw blown away. He didn't have the lower half of his face, and they had to figure out ways to feed him this and that. I didn't think he was going to survive much longer, but the things that you saw every day weren't, the things that you see in a war, even if you're not a grunt, if you're not an infantryman, are things that you can't often talk to people about when you get back, because they have no way of understanding it. I had some good friends who were guys who were LAPD, in fact, in the 70s, who had been over there. We could have conversations. We could talk about what we had seen, and they understood the fact that there were race riots in Vietnam. People don't talk about that, okay? There were times when troops would come in from the fields and try to tell guys who were stationed in or near cities. My information office was at headquarters compound in Quin Yen. There were fights downtown between soldiers who would come in and out of the field, black and white soldiers, because white soldiers would tell black guys, you can't come in here. Wait a minute, hold up. You know, we're all green, supposedly. You know, and it doesn't mean light green go over here, dark green go over there. That wasn't the way, you know, it was supposed to work. I tended to be an advocate at times when necessary, when guys were getting into trouble. I had done a little troop pushing when I was at Fort Huachuca, and I found out that a lot of guys, I had a platoon of guys at one point that I was in charge of that had all been, for the most, probably 70% of them had been in the stockade, usually for things that had nothing to do with crime. A lot of the Hispanic guys, because they didn't understand the language. So in my platoon, I started getting the guys who spoke English to work with the guys who didn't. You know, to help them, because they were going to need that kind of thing. When I came out of the military, I still haven't changed, like I said, basically. With what I do as a cartoonist now, it's a running commentary on what's going on. And yes, I pick up and point out racism, you know, and it comes from both sides. Like I said, I'm an independent. I see some things from the Democrats and I see it from the Republicans. My best friend used to be media guy for the Libertarian Party. Okay, one of my oldest close buddies. We fuss and fight. We'll probably do it until we're 90 if we can live that long. But I was able to, going back, and I have to go back to 1962 for a minute. Two of the guys who became good friends of mine, Bill Rusky and Larry Wigg at the time, were two young white guys who were trying to write a book about the civil rights movement. I don't know whatever happened after a while, but Lawrence Maxon Wigg was a part of the Maxon family, that the truck people, and they talked me out of going to a Klan rally. They left me, actually. I wanted to go to a Klan rally with them and hide in the trunk of their car at Stone Mountain. That's how silly I was. But they were at LSU for the summer and did that. What I learned was, you know, I think during that period of time was how to take people according to who they were and how they were to me, as opposed to, because I made some friends that, you know, I couldn't ask somebody just because they were black to risk their life for me. And they did, and some guys did some things that were about the fact that we were friends as opposed to the fact that we had different colors. So I try to look at, you know, the heart of the person. I think that's what's important to me in terms of where I am now. And again, Sam Caston was my buddy in Baton Rouge who died back in, 99, 2000. But Sam was the one who said, you know, to him, you know, the four races of men were A, B, B, and O. You know, and again, you can't tell who's what, because we laughed, we were both B's and both our wives were O's, so we said, well, we're in interracial marriages, even though they look the same, you know. He says, but if I'm, you know, he says, if I'm going to the hospital, he says, I'm not going to ask you for a piece of, I'm not going to say, give me some skin. He says, but I will say, give me some blood. You know, and so we started looking at it, like, and then why we were friends, because sometimes friends have to question why you're friends. I learned over the years, when I worked at Southern, and I'm trying to catch up so we can move forward, some of the guys that I had a good chance to work with when they were students, Mel Blount, Harold Carmichael, if you're football fans, Isaiah Robertson, who played for the Rams. I was a few years older than them. I was 26. Most of these guys are 21, 22, and I still refer to them as my kids, okay? Because I was just older enough to deal with them. Robert Love and I, who played for the Bulls, were classmates. And we were, well, he was a year behind me, but we were good. The friendships that you develop over these times and doing different things. When I worked at Grambling, well, not at Grambling, but for Black Associated Sports Enterprises, this was the first black sports network on television. It should have been what became BET. But we were trying to do things. I was trying to convince people that we should do films on folk like Robert Smalls. And they were going, who's Robert Smalls? Well, I had a bad attitude in those days, and I called a couple producers some things that they didn't really like when it came down to saying you're stupid, but I didn't have that restraint, After I ran my own business, I freelanced as a writer, as an artist. I did a little film work here, a little TV work there. I did some ghost writing, rewriting scripts for other people and things like that. Some freelance public relations for about 10 years. Moved back to Louisiana and went to work for the first division of black culture of any state in the country. A friend, Ruth Wesley, was director. Edwin Edwards, the guy they called the Crook in Louisiana, started that. Okay, the Crook did more for black people than most of the other people who followed him. And for some strange reason, though they never mentioned this, the Crook always left the state in the black. Yeah, budget-wise, the state was always in the black when the Crook was running it. Now, like him or not, and I have friends who hate him, I try to look down the middle at it. Why do you hate the guy who was supposedly the crook who made money for everybody and who only took $1 a year for his job? Yeah, okay, so maybe you should have paid him a percentage of what he made. Logically, for me, that might have made more sense because if he was going to CEO the state and he was making money, it made, But we made strides then, I think, because we were able to move agenda forward. I put out a national thing to all of the black radio stations in the country, or the radio stations with majority black audiences about, and I'm not taking credit for this, but it became a thing. Black 365 Black was the idea. We're not just black in February. Okay? By that time, it was we are black 365 days a year. Let's go with this. The mayor of Baton Rouge could tell you about that, Kip Holden, because he was on radio at the time, and I used to do a few things with him to let him know, to put history into his show. And he was concerned about that. He was good. He went back to law school, became a legislator, and now he's on his second or third term as mayor of Baton Rouge.
Can you comment on sort of culture and politics being intertwined and not separate entities?
They are very much so because politics impact culture. And a part of how that happens is if you are not concerned about the culture and you are in power, you can hurt cultures by overlooking them. I'm going to a meeting next week in Carrollton where one of the former city council members is trying to create a project that stresses the diversity of the city, which is minority white, technically. But it's in terms of the majority of the city council and those who govern it, white. Conservative also. So we have to deal with that, but it's how you have to deal with that, okay? Going back again, I moved back to Louisiana. After I left Division of Black Culture, I went to work for the Louisiana State Museum. It took about not quite a year off, but when I went to the Louisiana State Museum, I was the second black curator there. I was the first black Louisianian and first male to have a curatorial job there. we did get involved, and my wife knows I'm not going to stay on this, but I fell in love with the Mardi Gras Indians. And I did that in part because of the fact that I had heard about my Indian heritage in the family and this and that from my father, from my uncles, and from, bits and pieces of this and that, and I wanted to find out about it. So in '94, I did an exhibit on that. One of the funny things about it was a white photographer decided that I was being prejudiced because the show was about African American photographers looking at the black Indians in New Orleans. And I wound up having to ask him to bring a note from his mother certifying that he was black. And, he left us alone after that. But we've never been great friends since then. We won't be, probably. But, I'm not going to miss him. I have enough friends. The thing that I discovered along the way was, again, interoffice politics also, not just, state, local government, but it filters all the way down to the basic level where you have to sometimes remind people that, look, stop and think before you react. Because I look at it like this. I said the first thing the average white person that I know, and I'm using that generically, is going to think about is how to do the white thing. The people who want to do right will think that, but stop. I try not to be black reactive. I'm not going to just react out of what I've accepted what I am culturally. I know who I am. I define me. I call myself an American African. I'm of African descent. But everybody on this planet, according to the folk that I know think about it, and who are not bound by some religious myth or whatever, understand where mankind started, in that place we now call Africa. So we're all Africans in that sense. Maybe, as John Sinclair, the poet, said, we should call this planet Africa and get on with it, because the climate made us look different. And how we play with history comes out of who became the powers, who got to write the story, that line again. When I found that thing, until a lion writes his own story, the tale of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. A friend Khalid Hafiz that I work with at Jazz Fest in New Orleans, I used to represent the museum doing things on the Black Heritage stage. Then it became the African Heritage stage, over a period of time. We had to make gradual changes to get people to understand what the culture was about and how we were approaching it so that it could be informative for everyone and hopefully elevate the level of consciousness for all of the people we were dealing with. How we were able to, I was able to go into schools and talk to kids and tell them about what it was like being in jail because I'd been in jail. They listened to that and understood that I wasn't kidding them. There's no BS here. There is, I wasn't a hero. I was a foot soldier. That's what I think of myself as when it comes to civil rights. I was another person who was there. I was able to make some differences, but my differences were on the one-to-one level more so than on the 1 to 1,000. But I've always felt like this, and I've had a little success in teaching kids about art and about history. And when I teach art and history and music. We talk about the blues, we talk about jazz, we talk about the history of African people in the world and the interactions between the groups of people, why and how people think of different things. This is what I think we need to know. I think we have to be self-defining. I define Chuck Siler based on what I learned from history, but I've had a chance over the years to meet all kinds of folk. I've had friends who did all sorts of things. Lenny Bruce's mother brought me chicken soup when I had the flu. Sally Marr was in it. And I knew her through other friends who were comics. They knew me because I was a cartoonist and I was accepted as a comic because I did cartoons and sometimes wrote a line here or two. I've been an official cartoonist for 2 comedy clubs in the Comedy Store at one point in the early 70s and the Improv in the early 80s because I lived in the neighborhood. I hung out there. The comics knew I was a writer. They knew I was a cartoonist. We had sometimes very serious discussions about perceptions, how we perceived each other, what was funny, why was it funny. If you could tell a black joke, I could tell a good Polish joke. I could tell a joke about anybody if it were that way, and I wasn't afraid to, because if you thought you could bring it, if you can't take it, don't bring it, was the case. And I've got some old friends that we can't laugh out loud about some of the things that we've laughed about over the years, but they all understand that the bottom line is the humanity. This is what we have to work toward, and this is how we have to deal with those people who are too stupid to understand. Who 1 + 1 has to be 3. Are you giving time now?
I was going to say, I think that might be perfect right there. I was going to ask as a final question if you could comment on the power of the pen and the power of humor, but you basically just.
I think this. People, I have a good audience. We were talking earlier, and I was telling you, I'm editorial page cartoonist for the Louisiana Weekly. The black commentator uses my stuff. I've got, 10 people, good friends. The Louisiana Folk Net puts it out whenever I send it to them. I've written about it, and I still do write occasionally about it, do a little review, things like that. I've got friends, I guess, from every walk of life. A lot of them are in academia. Some of them are now retired from there. A lot of them are professional journalists still. I hear from them if I get slightly off tack, if I don't use enough female characters in the cartoons, I have some lady friends who will say, you don't use enough women. I say, okay, remind me if I, because you do what's instinctive, what's natural. I find that if I can make a person laugh more often than not, they'll remember what I said. If I hear, I notice that sometimes I'll do things and I'll get responses from places that I didn't expect, or from people that I didn't expect to hear from. Okay, I had an instructor who died a few weeks ago. Name was Hugh Perkins. When we did the Baton Rouge bus boycott piece, I was telling you about Doug Brinkley and some of the other guys who were there. Doug and, like I said, we were on different ends of the podium, but we caught everybody in the middle and did it. But I told a story about how Dr. Perkins used to close his classes. And I had a humanities class under him in an amphitheater-style room, a choir room, and I would always sat up at the back where I could watch everything going on. And Dr. Perkins used to like to close with Rostand, with Cyrano de Bergerac, whom I later found out was the father of modern science fiction in real life. Yeah. And, he would cite Roxanne's realization that Cyrano was the person who wrote those letters for Christian. And girls would get up and walk out of the class, leave their purses, leave their coats in the wintertime, and come back in embarrassed. And I'd sit back there and say, I gotta be like that. I said, I want to be like him. I want to be able to do that. I want to be able to make them listen, He was one of the teachers that I had who could convince a class like that, the charismatic teacher. So you try to take a little bit of each one of those. But I had him almost fall out of his seat because we used to play tennis together. And I told him he was the most literate, trash-talking tennis player that I had ever met in my life. And he loved it. But when I wrote my last column from a student newspaper, he sent me a note telling me to keep on doing that. You know, he says, you own it. You know, he encouraged me, go on with that. So, you know, here I am 50 some odd years later trying to do the same thing. And when I look back at the people who contributed to who I am, I carry a little piece of all of them. You know, when John Franklin and Lonnie and the guys sent the letter saying, you know, they want you to do this, it was just about, I got that letter about a few days after Ethan was born, okay? I said, I got a grandson. I got to leave something so that one day when my son takes his son to that museum, if they want to call up the interview and see it, I want him to understand, you know, something about his heritage, his personal heritage. You know, who raised your daddy? You know, so you can go out there and you can be your own man because that's what it's about. You know, it's the same thing that you get when I talk to kids in my workshops. You know, we sit down and we talk about music. I tell them about who Alvin Baptiste was, who Danny Barker was, who these musicians that came out of our hometown, the Tabby Thomases, you know, who Henry Butler is. I let them hear the music, let them hear brass band music. Talk to them about the art of what the Mardi Gras Indians do, mobile art, okay? Every time, you know, you come into a museum like this, one of the greatest collections of folk art that you're gonna find is right here where we're sitting, okay? Harry Robinson has been collecting for years. The fact that we have to celebrate this, we have to understand why it's done, what motivates the artist. It's not money, because if it were just money, I'd like to be wealthy. But I don't stop doing the art because of the fact that I'm not wealthy. Okay, I have something to say and I have an audience. I play with that. You know, I try to reach the audience. My audience extends it. And sometimes I hear from places, like I said, that I never expected to hear from because a friend of mine sent it out to his business list. And I have one guy in California who does that. He's got a big list. I wish mine were. But his people resend it. You know, email, if I had email 30 years, if we had email in 1960, the civil rights movement would have been over by 1965, the way we were approaching it, because we would have been hitting people. You wouldn't have been able to open your computer without getting us. You know, the thing is that when I look back at that, I said, boy, when I had Mel and those guys at Southern playing ball, I said, if I had email then, you know, it was mimeograph, copy, walk in, go to a press conference, and if you had to do it with the pro teams, and I had that once with the Rams, I literally memorized my stats so I wouldn't have to stand up there and constantly refer to it because of what was expected. Here's this guy from this little black school, okay? So those teachers who told me you had to be 3 times as good were whispering in my ear saying, you know, you got to show them how good you are. And it's something that I think was a part of that motivation, and it's a part of what is ongoing in terms of what motivates me to try to continuously make a statement. You know, and to make a statement that is a human statement more so than just you know, someone asked me once, Mr. Hubbard, Gene Paul, I studied with Gene Paul Hubbard and Frank Hayden. Frank Hayden was a sculptor. We had a lot of one-on-one conversations. Harold Curo, who taught me things that paid my rent for a long time, he taught commercial art and graphic design and whatever. These guys always stressed the fact that we had to be able to get out and not be them. It's don't say you're not a little Gene Paul Hubbard, you're not a little Frank Hayden. You're going to be, we're sending you out to be Chuck Siler. And this is what this is what I represent. All of those people who I named, the guys who went to jail with me, the Willie Bradfords. Willie Bradford jerked me away from a door that would have taken off my left hand because a deputy sheriff slapped on it. There was a lady I forgot to mention, and I got to do this to close it before. In 1962, when I was doing the voter registration project, there was a lady who lived in an area that they called the Park. I remember her name was Miss Williams. I could be wrong after all this time, but she reminded me when she went to register to vote, she got flunked twice. Okay, over BS. But she was determined. She was 84 years old in 1962, that she was going to vote before she died. She was going to be a registered voter. She was going to have the card. And the third time she went in, I went with her. Now, I was young and stupid and not unlike a lot of folk. I was 19 years old. I had my gun stashed under my jacket in the back. And if anybody had done anything, it could have been a real bad scene that day, and I would have been remembered for something else. Okay, but she was going to go in there. When she walked through, it was like Lola Eli walking through those same guys about 7 or 8 months before when we got out of jail that January. For whatever reason, they wanted to intimidate one old lady, and they failed horribly because she walked through. She reminded me of Mary McLeod Bethune. I always think of her when I remember this lady dressed well, put on a nice suit, and Charles, we're going, and someone drove us down. I forget who it was now, but we walked in, and like I said, I was prepared to shoot somebody if they had decided to go that far. They didn't, because when she walked in, she was in charge. They moved aside, she walked, and when she walked into the registrar of voters office, I was sure, you can't go in there. I said, no problem. I stood back against the wall, and I got a corner. Okay, vantage point, advantage point, as readers always look for, okay? And I was waiting, and I was standing there like this. And I was pressing that little Beretta because I wanted to, when she came out, she had the smile on her face, okay? That made all of it worth it. It was, as good as it could get at that moment because she got what she wanted. And she got to vote before she died. And, you think about being 84 in 1962. Her parents had been slaves. Okay, to her, it was important. I'm a person who gets upset when somebody tells me they can't go, they're not going to vote. I don't care if you, vote for the person who's going to do you the least harm, if nothing else. But try to understand what and why you're doing it. Understand, I learn from my wife every day. My wife, being a government teacher, I'm one of her better students. And what happens, I pass the test when I can make her laugh. Because to a large degree, that's what it's about. If I can put an idea that she passes on to me out and get a reaction from my public, one of the things that artists always want, and I think it happens in anything else, you don't want ennui. You want a positive reaction or a negative you want a reaction. I don't care what the reaction is, because I got a good friend who's a Republican, who is diehard, okay, diehard black Republican. He's not quite as far right as Adam West of those people, and I managed to bring him back a bit. But we've had some great arguments, but we love each other like brothers, and we will fight intellectually like brothers. And my point is, I have lessons I learned from him, because I learned what that side is thinking. My buddy who's a libertarian, I learned what the libertarians are thinking. I have two good friends who are imams, okay? They aren't radicals. You know, they aren't going to go out and blow anybody up. They are parents. But we can talk, because my Baptist minister buddies, I haven't been, I go to church for funerals. Okay, I have my own belief. It took years, and it took black preachers who didn't want to become a part of it to make me go to look. The minister at the church that I used to attend wouldn't let me do workshops for voter registration in his church because he was afraid. Okay, I was not being afraid. And I couldn't respect him because of the fact that, how are you going to tell me you believe in something that you're scared to stand up for it? I said, what would Jesus Christ do to you? Or what would he have to say about you if you did? What would the Prophet Muhammad have to say if you didn't stand up? I like the Quakers because the American Friends Service Committee helped us out a lot during the Civil Rights Movement. Yeah, they gave us places to meet. We did what we could, So that's, I don't know if there's much more to say.
And I don't think we have much more time.
Yeah, I'm waiting for you to say stop.
I didn't want to stop. I don't want to stop, but we got to get on an airplane, unfortunately. But so let me just say again, thank you so much.
Oh, I appreciate.
This video raises questions, and I need for you to be extremely honest in the comments when answering them. And just so you know, I have two questions. Number one, what are your thoughts about this video? Please share them in the comments. And number two, who would you like to see me do a video on next? Now, please be honest in the comments when answering these questions. Share this video with anyone you deem necessary, and don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel.